The old church bell tolled once. No one had pulled the rope. The sky was clear, yet a window shattered. At precisely noon, a letter, yellowed with age, appeared on the steps of Willow Creek's post office. It was addressed to a man who had died 40 years ago. And inside was a secret that would tear the whole town apart. The sheriff stared at the letter, hands trembling. Then he said just one thing. Find her before it's too late. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. Now, friends, let me tell you what happened in Willow Creek that summer of 1997, when the world still felt just a little slower, a little safer, and when men still tipped their hats to ladies on Main Street. Willow Creek was the kind of town that barely showed up on a map, tucked between the slow bends of the Missouri River and the endless fields of golden wheat. Folks knew each other's granddaddies and birthmarks. Secrets, though, oh, secrets floated through that town like smoke nobody wanted to breathe in too deep. Sheriff Harold Boone was the man everybody trusted. Harold wasn't the kind of fellow to shout or wave a pistol around. He kept peace the old-fashioned way, by knowing folks' hearts better than they knew themselves. His wife, Mabel, used to say Harold had a nose for lies the way a hound had a nose for foxes. The day that letter came, Harold was sipping black coffee at Elsie's diner, same as he did every Tuesday morning. His boots were polished clean, badge shining in the weak sun. Elsie herself shuffled over, worry lining her brow deeper than usual. "Harold," she said, setting down his pie, "you might want to see what's going on down at the post office." When Harold got there, a crowd had already gathered, the old farmers leaning on canes, the mothers shielding their children's eyes like they could sense something wasn't right. The letter sat on the bottom step, as if some invisible hand had placed it there with great care. It was addressed in faded ink. To Mr. Samuel Granger, care of Willow Creek Post Office. But Samuel Granger had been dead 40 years. Shot dead in the woods under circumstances folks stopped talking about not long after the funeral. No arrest. No trial. Just a quiet whisper that justice had its own way of working things out. Harold picked up the letter, careful like it was made of glass. His thumb brushed the wax seal, a crooked W pressed deep into the red. He looked around. No one spoke. Not even the crows dared. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of brittle paper. 6 words written in a trembling hand. She knows. She always knew. Help. And beneath that, a name no one had dared speak in years. Amelia Granger. Samuel Granger's daughter. A girl who had vanished one hot August night without a trace. The case had broken the heart of the town, stitched it back together wrong, left it forever aching. Folks said she ran off with a carnival. Others said she drowned herself in the river. A few whispered darker things in the hush of twilight. But Harold, he had always carried a quiet belief. That Amelia Granger was out there. Waiting. Watching. Maybe even planning. Harold called together the only men he trusted, his deputy, Walt Briggs, old as dust but sharp as a hawk, and Pastor Jim Holloway, whose sermons could lift a soul or scare the devil out of a sinner depending on the day. They gathered in the back room of the sheriff's office, the letter spread out like a wound nobody wanted to touch. "Somebody's playing games," Walt muttered, squinting at the seal. Jim Holloway shook his head, voice low and thoughtful. "Or somebody's finally telling the truth." Harold leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "We find her. We ask her ourselves." It wasn't long before the first whisper came. A sighting. A woman, late 30s maybe, thin and pale, seen down by the old Granger property, a house that had rotted into the earth, left alone like folks were afraid the soil itself was cursed. Harold rode out with Walt, gravel crunching under the tires like old bones breaking. The air smelled of dust and forgotten things. They found nothing but broken boards and the slow, whispering sway of the wheat fields. But something about the place felt wrong, Harold thought. Like it was holding its breath. That night, Harold sat on his porch, dog curled at his feet, watching the stars. He turned the letter over and over in his hand. 6 words, carved into the marrow of the town itself. The next morning, another letter appeared. This time, nailed to Harold's own front door. Same seal. Same hand. It read. You trusted the wrong man. Below it, a name. Deputy Walt Briggs. Harold stared at that paper, heart heavy. Could it be? Could it really be? Old Walt, who had stood by him through 2 decades of hardship, through bar fights and missing cattle and broken-hearted widows. Harold knew one thing for certain. By sunset, he would find out. Or die trying. The sun that day crawled across the sky like a wounded animal, slow and pitiless, casting long crooked shadows over Willow Creek. Sheriff Harold Boone sat in his truck outside Deputy Walt Briggs' house, engine running low and steady, like the heartbeat of a man walking into a storm he knew he couldn't dodge. He watched the worn front porch, the sagging screen door, the way Walt's hound lay half asleep in the dust, unaware that the world might be coming apart before sundown. Harold thought about the years. Walt had been his right hand. His drinking buddy on hard nights, his steady shot when trouble stirred, his silent companion on long drives to crime scenes where even the air smelled of sadness. And now this letter. That name. Those 6 cruel words. You trusted the wrong man. Harold shut off the engine, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. He stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, hat low over his eyes. Walt appeared at the door just as Harold reached the steps, like he'd been watching too, like some old soldier sensing the battle coming. Come on in, Harold, Walt said, voice rough like bark. Coffee's still hot. They sat at Walt's kitchen table, the one that had seen more laughter and spilled whiskey than either man cared to admit. Harold laid the letter down between them without a word. Walt read it. Twice. When he finally looked up, there was a strange thing in his eyes, not fear exactly, but something colder. Something Harold had never seen before in all their years. You think I wrote this? Walt asked, low and even. I think, Harold said slowly, that I got a letter nailed to my door at midnight. And somebody wants me to think you're hiding something. Walt leaned back, hands flat on the table. You know I didn't have nothing to do with Amelia Granger's disappearance. Harold watched him close. You were the first deputy on scene, Walt. You were the one said you found no tracks. No signs of struggle. I found what there was to find, Walt said, jaw tight. Silence stretched between them, heavy and mean. You ever think, Walt said finally, voice softer, that maybe Amelia didn't disappear? Harold narrowed his eyes. Speak plain. Maybe, Walt said, almost whispering now, she was taken. And then, before Harold could press him, Walt did something that chilled him to the bone. He smiled. Not a friendly smile. A sad, broken thing, like a man remembering a debt he couldn't pay off no matter how many lifetimes he lived. That night, Harold sat back in his office, the ceiling fan whining overhead, thinking hard. He needed proof. He needed answers. He pulled the old case files out of the locked drawer, brittle papers, faded photographs, fingerprints smudged with time. He read every word about the night Amelia disappeared. And he found something he had never noticed before. A missing report, handwritten, filed by Samuel Granger himself 2 days before his death. It said Amelia had been scared. Terrified of someone she wouldn't name. Someone close. Someone she trusted. The report had been signed, but the signature wasn't Samuel's usual handwriting. Harold felt the hairs on his arms rise. He compared it to other samples. The signature matched. Deputy Walt Briggs. Exactly. Harold decided to act. At dawn, he went out to the old Granger property again, alone this time. The air smelled wetter, heavier, like a storm about to break. He crossed the fallen fence, boots sinking into the soft earth. The house stood there like a skeleton, windows hollow, boards rotting. He found the cellar door half buried in weeds. Pried it open. And down there, in the gloom, he found a box. A wooden chest, padlocked. He smashed the lock open with the heel of his boot. Inside were photographs. Hundreds of them. All of Amelia. From the time she was a toddler to the summer she disappeared. But the last few photographs were different. She looked older. Scared. Her face pale, her eyes haunted. And in the background of one photo, just a faint, blurred figure, was Walt Briggs. Watching her. Harold drove back into town with his gut churning. He had enough to confront Walt. Enough to break a heart. Enough, maybe, to break the man himself. He stormed into Walt's house, gun drawn. But Walt was gone. The back door hung open, swinging gently in the wind. And there, pinned to the inside of the door with an old hunting knife, was another letter. This time, just 3 words. Too late, Harold. Harold staggered back, the ground tilting under him. Somewhere in town, Walt was loose. Running. Hiding. Or worse, hunting. By nightfall, a new name floated into Harold's ear, whispered by a tearful widow who came to the station with trembling hands and a terrible confession. I saw him, she sobbed. Back then, the night Amelia vanished. Walt wasn't alone. Harold leaned forward, every muscle locked tight. Who was with him? She shivered, voice breaking. The pastor, she said. Pastor Jim Holloway. And in that moment, Harold felt the whole world tilt sideways. Because if Jim, kind, trusted, good Jim, had been there that night, then everything Harold believed about Willow Creek was about to come undone. Sheriff Harold Boone sat alone in the empty church, the heavy smell of old wood and candle wax filling his lungs. He stared up at the stained glass windows, watching how the morning light turned the faces of saints into something more broken than holy. He thought about Jim Holloway. The man who had baptized Harold's grandchildren. The man who had stood with Harold at his wife's funeral, speaking words so gentle and so sure that they had carried Harold through the darkest hours of his life. The man Harold now had to believe might have been part of the greatest betrayal Willow Creek had ever hidden. It took a long time for Harold to get up from that pew. Longer still to make the slow walk across town to the parsonage, where Jim lived alone since his own wife passed 20 years back. The house was quiet, the garden neat as a pin. But as Harold knocked on the door, he felt it again, that wrongness he had felt at the Granger house, like the air itself was bracing for something terrible. The door swung open. Jim stood there, smile warm, eyes bright behind thick glasses. Harold, he said, voice smooth as river stones. What brings you here so early? Harold studied him a long moment. Mind if I come in? Jim stepped aside, no hesitation, no sign of fear. Inside, the house was just as Harold remembered, pictures of smiling families on the walls, a Bible so worn it looked like it had been carried through wars. They sat at the kitchen table. Harold didn't waste time. You know why I'm here, Jim. The pastor's smile faded just a little. I reckon I might, he said slowly. Folks talk. And you been looking mighty troubled, Harold. Harold laid the latest letter on the table between them, the one with Walt's name, the one that had started all this. Jim leaned over it, his face unreadable. You knew about Amelia, Harold said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Back then. Jim folded his hands, fingers trembling ever so slightly. I knew she was scared, he said finally. I knew she came to me once, looking for sanctuary. Harold's heart thudded against his ribs. Why didn't you say anything? Jim looked away, toward the sunlit window. Because, he said, voice cracking, I thought I could protect her. I thought, if I kept quiet, if I watched over her from a distance, she'd be safe. Harold leaned in, eyes narrowing. From who, Jim? Jim's mouth trembled. From her own father. And with those 5 words, Harold felt the floor give out from under him. It was like the walls of memory cracked wide open. Samuel Granger, pillar of the community, war hero, businessman, had always been regarded as a hard man, but fair. No one had ever dared whisper anything darker. But Jim spoke now. Spoke of nights Amelia spent hiding at the church. Of bruises she tried to cover with long sleeves and forced smiles. Of the time she begged Jim to help her run away. I should have called you, Harold, Jim said, voice broken with shame. But I was a coward. I thought if I handled it quietly, she could have a life somewhere far away. Harold sat back, the world spinning. Then why, he rasped, did she vanish? Jim closed his eyes, pain etched deep into every line of his face. Because Walt found out. Walt, and another. Harold's blood turned to ice. Who? Jim opened his eyes. A man named Tobias Crow. Harold stiffened. Tobias Crow had been Samuel's business partner, a man who left Willow Creek 2 days after Samuel was found dead, never to return. Some said Tobias moved out west, others said he died in a bar fight. No one really knew. But if Tobias was involved, this ran even deeper than Harold could have imagined. Later that afternoon, Harold went to the archives at Town Hall, searching for anything he could find about Tobias Crow. He found old deeds, old court papers, and a photograph that stopped him cold. A photograph of Tobias standing beside Samuel and Walt at a town fundraiser. And behind them, almost hidden, stood Jim. Head bowed. Hands clasped. Looking, even then, like a man carrying a secret too heavy to bear. As dusk fell, Harold headed back to the Granger property one more time. Something gnawed at him, some instinct that wouldn't be still. The setting sun cast long shadows over the ruins of the house. He stepped into the hollowed-out living room. And there, carved into the back of the old stone fireplace, almost invisible unless the light hit just right, he saw it. A message, scratched deep into the stone. Still alive. Harold's heart slammed against his ribs. Still alive. Amelia? After all these years? Had she hidden herself away somewhere? Had someone hidden her? The air seemed to shiver around him. And that's when he heard it. A footstep. Behind him. Slow. Deliberate. Harold turned, gun half raised. And standing there, outlined in the last blood-orange light of sunset, was a figure he hadn't seen in 20 years. A woman. Thin. Pale. Eyes wide with terror. And she whispered his name. Harold, help me. Sheriff Harold Boone stood frozen in the ruins of the old Granger house, staring at the ghost before him, a woman he had long buried in memory, a woman the town had mourned and whispered about and forgotten. Amelia Granger was alive. And her face, once so full of youthful light, now bore the terrible weight of surviving in the dark. She staggered toward him, each step trembling, as though the earth itself tried to drag her back into hiding. Harold reached out instinctively, but Amelia flinched away, her wide eyes darting to the broken windows, the open door. Is he here? She whispered. Did he follow you? Harold shook his head slowly, voice low and steady like a prayer. No one's gonna hurt you, Amelia. You're safe now. But the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. Because Harold knew better. In Willow Creek, safety was a word long since emptied of meaning. They sat together in Harold's truck, parked under the leaning shadow of an old oak, far from town. Harold wrapped a worn blanket around Amelia's shoulders, his hands gentle but firm, like handling something too fragile for this world. Bit by bit, between shudders and long silences, Amelia spoke. She spoke of nights locked away in basements. Of a father who wore smiles for the town but fists for his family. Of a man named Tobias Crow who offered her a way out, a bargain paid in secrets and silence. Of Deputy Walt Briggs, who found her once she tried to escape and told her running would only make it worse. And then, of Pastor Jim Holloway. The man she had trusted above all others. The man who had promised her sanctuary. The man who, when it mattered most, turned his back to save his own name. I ran, Amelia whispered, tears streaking through the dirt on her face. The night Samuel died, I ran into the fields. I thought I was free. But someone caught me. She looked up at Harold, her voice breaking like dry wood. It wasn't Walt. It wasn't Tobias. It wasn't Jim. Harold leaned in closer, heart thudding, breath held tight in his chest. It was Sheriff Boone. For a long moment, Harold didn't understand. And then realization hit like a hammer. Not him. Not his own hands. But the man who wore the badge before him. Sheriff Frank Keating. The man Harold had replaced 20 years ago after Keating's sudden retirement, a retirement folks thought strange even then, but no one had dared question. Keating had been Samuel Granger's closest friend. And, it seemed, his fiercest protector. Harold's blood turned cold. Frank Keating had helped cover it all up. Had helped hide Amelia away. Had betrayed his badge and his soul. Harold took Amelia to the old safe house behind Willow Creek, a dusty cabin used back in the days of bootleggers and river smugglers. Only a handful of men even knew it still existed. He locked the doors, shuttered the windows, left her with a pistol and a promise. I'll end this, he said. And he meant it. With every battered inch of his old, stubborn heart. Harold returned to town under cover of darkness, anger burning through his veins hotter than any fire he'd ever known. He found Jim Holloway at the church, kneeling in the pews, praying so hard his knuckles turned white. Harold stood over him. Get up, Jim. Jim lifted his head slowly, tears streaming down his lined face. I tried, he whispered. I tried to save her. Harold's voice was iron. You tried to save yourself. Jim crumpled, broken and weeping, but Harold had no time for mercy. There was one more man who needed to answer for the sins of Willow Creek. Frank Keating. Only Frank wasn't in his old house on Sycamore Street. And he wasn't down at Elsie's diner, sipping coffee like he used to every afternoon. No, Harold found Frank where all cowards end up. At the cemetery. Standing over the empty grave of Samuel Granger. Talking to it. Begging it. Apologizing to it. Harold approached, boots crushing dead leaves, the night wind cold against his face. Frank turned, face hollow, eyes wild with the look of a man who had lived too long under the weight of his own rot. You don't understand, Harold, he rasped. We did what we had to do. You hit a child, Harold said, each word a bullet. You let monsters run free. Frank staggered back, hands raised like a man who'd forgotten long ago how to fight. It was never supposed to get this bad, he sobbed. We thought, if she disappeared, the town could heal. Harold pulled out his handcuffs, the weight of justice heavier than ever. Willow Creek doesn't heal by burying the truth. He snapped the cuffs on Frank's trembling wrists. You heal by dragging it into the light. Harold led Frank down the hill toward the patrol car. But halfway there, a shot cracked through the night. Frank jerked, a red blossom blooming on his chest. Harold dropped, instinct pulling him behind a stone angel. Another shot whined past his ear. From the trees. Someone was out there. Someone who wasn't done yet. Harold dragged Frank's lifeless body behind cover, heart pounding. And from the shadows of the trees, a voice called out. Soft. Almost kind. Should have left it buried, Harold. Harold recognized it instantly. Walt Briggs. Still alive. Still dangerous. And hunting. Sheriff Harold Boone crouched behind the stone angel, heart thundering in his ears, feeling the weight of every year he had carried on his back, every mistake, every blind trust, every silent prayer that Willow Creek was better than the shadows whispered. Walt Briggs was alive. And he had a rifle aimed into the night. Harold knew he couldn't sit still for long. He took a deep breath, the kind a man takes when he knows the next steps might be his last, and shouted into the darkness. "Walt! You don't have to finish this." A long silence answered. Then Walt's voice, low and tired. "You still don't see it, Harold. You never saw it. Always chasing ghosts while the real devil shook your hand every Sunday." Harold scanned the trees, searching for movement, for any flicker of light off a scope or barrel. "I know about Keating," Harold called. "I know about Samuel. About Tobias. About Jim. But it's over. Amelia's alive." Another pause. And then, a laugh, broken and bitter. "You think Amelia's the key?" Walt said. "You think finding her solves anything?" A shadow moved at the edge of the trees. Harold pivoted. And as Walt stepped into the moonlight, rifle loose in his hands, Harold saw something he hadn't expected. Walt was crying. Real tears. Walt dropped the rifle to the ground with a clatter that echoed like thunder. "You still don't get it," he said, voice cracking. "I wasn't trying to kill you, Harold. I was trying to kill him." Walt pointed to the grave. To Samuel Granger's empty grave. "He ain't there," Walt whispered. And Harold felt the bottom fall out of the world. 2 decades of belief crumbled in that instant. Harold approached cautiously, gun still ready, but Walt raised his hands, palms outward, surrendering. "He's alive," Walt said, each word slicing through the cold night like a blade. "Samuel Granger never died." Harold shook his head, refusing, unable to believe. "I saw the body," he said. "I was at the funeral." "You saw what they wanted you to see," Walt replied. A body burned beyond recognition. A coffin closed. A few old war medals thrown in to make it real. It came rushing back, the hurried funeral, the sealed casket, the quick burial. How folks had whispered, but then fallen silent under the heavy, watchful eyes of the town elders. Samuel Granger had faked his death. With the help of Frank Keating. With Tobias Crow. And Jim Holloway. All to cover the darkness inside that house. All to let Samuel slip away and start fresh somewhere else. All while Amelia suffered in the shadows. "You don't get it," Walt said again, voice trembling. "They made a deal. Samuel got away, and in return, the town got quiet. No scandal. No shame. But you?" Harold asked, his voice raw. Walt laughed, broken. "I wanted out. I wanted it to end. But I knew too much. They would have buried me right next to him if I didn't play along." Harold lowered his gun slowly. His mind raced. If Samuel was alive, he could be anywhere. Watching. Pulling strings even now. Harold remembered Amelia's terror, her glances over her shoulder even when safe. It wasn't just memory haunting her. It was knowledge. She knew Samuel wasn't dead. She knew he might come back. Harold cuffed Walt gently, without anger, without hate. Just a quiet, grim necessity. "You're coming with me," Harold said. "And we're going to finish this the right way." Together, they drove back into Willow Creek. The town slept under a velvet sky, unaware that its deepest rot had finally cracked open. At the station, Harold secured Walt in a cell. Then he went to Amelia. She was sitting by the window of the safe house, the pistol still clutched in her lap. When she saw Harold, her face crumbled, not in fear, but in exhausted relief. "It's done," Harold said, sitting across from her. But Amelia shook her head. Tears welled in her hollowed eyes. "It'll never be done," she whispered. "Not until he's found." Harold nodded, heart sinking. He knew. Some ghosts couldn't be laid to rest until you put them in the ground yourself. Weeks passed. Investigations reopened. The governor himself sent a team from Jefferson City to comb through Willow Creek's dirty secrets. The names of men long thought respectable were dragged through the mud where they belonged. Jim Holloway stood trial, broken and weeping. Frank Keating's crimes were broadcast across the state, his legacy shattered beyond repair. And Walt Briggs, he testified. Every lie. Every crime. Every sin. He named them all. As part of his deal, Walt got a reduced sentence. But Harold knew, some prisons were built of steel, and some were built of memory. Walt would never leave his cell, even if the doors stood wide open. As for Samuel Granger, he remained a ghost. No trace. No sightings. No justice. Yet. But every night, before Harold closed his weary eyes, he thought of Samuel out there, older now, but still dangerous, still carrying the cruelty that had poisoned a whole town. And Harold promised himself, and Amelia, that one day, he would find him. Drag him into the light. And finally end it. For good. The last time Harold saw Amelia, she was standing at the edge of Willow Creek, a small suitcase in hand, the morning sun gilding her hair in a fragile halo. She turned to him, her smile weary but real. "Thank you," she said. Harold tipped his hat, words caught somewhere deep in his chest. "Go find your life," he said, voice rough. "You earned it." She nodded. And then, like a spirit freed from a long, dark prison, Amelia Granger walked away from the town that had tried to kill her. And into a future she built with her own trembling, fearless hands. Some stories don't end with parades. Or medals. Or a perfect, tied-up bow. Some stories end with a man sitting alone on his porch, watching the stars come out, holding a badge that feels heavier now than ever before. Sheriff Harold Boone sat there, sipping coffee gone cold, feeling the wind stir the wheat fields. And somewhere, far away, a storm gathered on the horizon. But for tonight, just tonight, Willow Creek slept. And for the first time in 20 years, it slept in peace. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.